At the New York airport, in the Friday morning rush, Jackson Rivers, a 46-year-old successful businessman, was hurrying to his gate. He was dressed to the nines in an expensive suit, carrying a leather briefcase and glancing at his gold watch every now and then. Another business trip, he thought with a touch of sadness, realizing that despite all his achievements, his life was empty, and no amount of money could fill that void. But suddenly his gaze was caught by a woman walking past with a child. A woman with brown hair was holding the hand of a boy of about 10. Jackson stopped, stunned. The face was painfully familiar. It was Linda. He barely audibly whispered her name, not believing his eyes. But it wasn't just the meeting with Linda that shocked him. The boy next to her seemed to bring his childhood photos to life. The same green eyes, the same unruly blonde hair, even the way he walked, which repeated his own. Memories came flooding back to Jack like a punch to the gut. He remembered leaving the apartment he shared with Linda 10 years ago, leaving only a cold note on the kitchen table. Linda had been asleep, her face calm, unaware that her life was about to fall apart. The thought struck him. Had Linda been pregnant then? Guilt washed over him. Had he left behind not only a wife, but a son he knew nothing about? Jackson, feeling his heart speed up, began to make his way toward Linda and the boy, desperately trying to catch up with them. He called her name, but his voice was drowned out by the noise of the airport. He pushed through the crowd, but when he finally reached the place where he had last seen them, Linda and the boy were gone. "Sir, are you all right?" the flight attendant asked, noticing his concern. Jackson barely heard her. At that moment, his phone rang. It was his current wife, Maria. He ignored the call, continuing to scan the crowd for familiar faces. "Sir, your flight is already departing," the flight attendant insisted, breaking him out of his thoughts. Jackson glanced at her, then at the gate, and back to the lounge. In that moment, he made a decision that would change his life. "I'm not going," he replied absent-mindedly. The stewardess looked surprised, but Jackson was already walking away, determined to find out the truth. On the street, Jackson waved down a taxi. "Downtown," he told the driver, his mind racing. As soon as the car merged into traffic, Jackson pulled out his phone and again ignored the missed calls from Maria. Instead, he dialed an old friend, a private detective. "Michael, this is Jackson. I need your help finding someone," he said as soon as Michael answered. Jackson told his friend everything he remembered about Linda, and the image of the boy, his possible son, kept coming back to him. Conflicting feelings tore at him from within: guilt, fear, a strange excitement. Jackson realized that his life was about to be turned upside down. For the first time, the money and status he had once craved seemed insignificant. All that mattered now was finding Linda and the boy, to try to right the wrongs of the past. When the taxi pulled up to Michael's office, Jackson took a deep breath and stepped out. Inside, he recounted the entire story. The meeting at the airport, his suspicions, his need to know the truth. "Do you realize this could change your life?" Michael asked anxiously. "I understand," Jackson replied, running his hand through his hair, "but I have to do this. I have to make this right." Michael nodded soberly and began jotting down details. "I need every detail you can remember. Linda's last known address, her job, any little details that might lead to something." Jackson closed his eyes, conjuring up images of Linda. Each memory left him with a twinge of guilt. "She was an elementary school teacher," he began. "She worked uptown. We lived in an apartment uptown." The phone rang again. It was Maria again. But Jackson ignored it, focusing entirely on the matter at hand. "It'll take a few days," Michael warned, glancing at the pad. "It'll take time to find something concrete. Do what you have to do. Money doesn't matter," Jackson replied, his voice betraying desperation. Leaving his friend's office, Jackson walked the streets of New York City, feeling like a stranger in the city that had once been his home. All the wealth and success he had sought now seemed meaningless. He would give anything to undo the fateful decisions that had led him to this day. In the days that followed, Jackson checked into a hotel and waited with bated breath for news from Michael. His sleep was restless, and thoughts of Linda and the boy who might have been his son haunted him. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Linda woke up early as usual. The small house she called her own was quiet, except for the soft sound of cartoons coming from the living room. "Ethan, breakfast is ready," Linda called, putting pancakes on the table. A 10-year-old boy with tousled blonde hair ran into the kitchen. "Pancakes," he said happily. Linda smiled and ruffled his hair even more. Her smile faded for a moment as she noticed again how much Ethan reminded her of Jackson. While Ethan ate, Linda's mind wandered. The first few years after Jackson had left had been a nightmare. Pregnant and alone, holding down a teaching job despite her growing belly. A scene came to mind. Linda, 8 months pregnant, sitting on the bathroom floor, unpaid bills scattered around her, fear for the future overwhelming her. Linda shook herself, pushing away the painful memories. "We did it, didn't we, honey?" she whispered to Ethan, who was too busy with the pancakes to notice. The doorbell rang. It was Mark, her boyfriend of the last 2 years, a kind man with a soft smile and gentle eyes. "Good morning, my loves," he said as he walked in, kissing Linda and hugging Ethan. Linda felt a wave of gratitude. Mark had been a real blessing to them, accepting Ethan as his own son. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Jackson received the first results from Michael. "She still lives in the same neighborhood," Michael said over the phone. "In a small house on Maple Street." Jackson's heart began to beat faster. So close, after so many years. "And the boy?" he asked excitedly. "Yes, she has a son, Ethan. He's 10 years old. He goes to a local school. Linda has been raising him alone since he was born." Michael's words cut Jackson. It was true. He had a son he'd never seen, who grew up without a father. "And one more thing," Michael continued. "Linda has been dating a guy named Mark for 2 years now, and he's an active participant in their lives." Jackson felt a surge of jealousy that surprised him. What right did he have to feel this way? Meanwhile, in her suburban New York mansion, Maria paced the streets, full of anger. Jackson hadn't answered her calls for days. First he'd missed an important flight, and now he'd disappeared altogether. "Something's wrong here," she muttered, running through the possible reasons for his absence in her head. At Linda's house, the morning went on as usual. Mark helped Ethan pack his backpack while Linda cooked him lunch. "Don't forget, dinner is at my parents' tonight," Mark reminded her gently. Linda nodded, smiling, but inside she felt a strange uneasiness. Ever since she had seen that man at the airport, the man who looked so much like Jackson, she had been unable to shake the feeling that something was about to change. Meanwhile, Jackson drove slowly down Maple Street, his heart stopping when he saw the modest house Michael had described. There was a swing in the front yard, a bike leaning against the porch. He parked across the street, wondering what to say, how to explain himself, how to apologize for the 10 years he had been gone. At that moment, the front door opened. Linda came out, beautiful as ever, followed by Ethan and the man Jackson assumed was Mark. They were laughing like a happy family, getting ready to take Ethan to school. Jackson sat back in his seat, his soul torn by a maelstrom of emotions. Guilt, regret, jealousy, fear, but also determination. He knew he had to be a part of this life somehow. He had to meet his son. He had to try to fix everything he had destroyed so long ago. But how could he do that without ruining the happiness Linda and Ethan seemed to have found? In the days that followed, Jackson couldn't tear himself away from Maple Street. He parked a few houses away and watched Linda and her family go about their daily lives. Every time he looked at Ethan, his heart sank. One sunny day, Jackson worked up the courage to get out of the car and, pretending to be a passerby, walked down the sidewalk across the street. At that moment, Linda went out to water the flowers, and their eyes met. Water splashed from her hands, soaking the ground. "Jackson," she whispered, not believing her eyes. Before he could answer, Linda crossed the street, her eyes blazing with anger. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice shaking. Jackson faltered. "Linda, I saw you and Ethan at the airport. I was supposed to." "Don't you dare say his name," Linda cut him off. "You have no right to do so." Neighbors began to look out of their windows, attracted by the noise. "Linda, please," Jackson begged. "I know I made a mistake, but Ethan, he's my son, right?" Linda closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, and when she opened them, there were unshed tears in them. Yes, she finally said. Ethan is your biological son, whom you abandoned without even knowing he existed. The words cut Jackson like a slap in the face. I didn't know, he whispered. If I had known. If you knew what? Linda interrupted. Would you have stayed? Don't kid yourself, Jackson. You made your choice 10 years ago. Jackson took a step forward. Let me meet him, please. I know I don't deserve it, but… No. Linda almost screamed. You're right. You don't deserve it. Ethan has a good life, a family that loves him. I won't let you ruin that. At that moment, a car pulled up to the house and Mark got out of it, looking first at the worried Linda, then at the stranger in the suit. Everything okay, dear? Mark asked, placing a protective hand on Linda's shoulder. Jackson felt a wave of irrational jealousy. This man was living the life he thought should be his. It's okay, Linda replied, not taking her eyes off Jackson. He's already leaving. Mark looked at them, feeling the tension. Do you know each other? He asked, but Linda didn't have time to answer. A school bus stopped at the corner, and Ethan walked towards them. Sarah felt a sense of panic. Jackson, go away now, she whispered. Without thinking, Jackson ducked behind a tree, his heart pounding as he watched Ethan, a spitting image of himself as a child, approach them. Mom, are you okay? Ethan asked, noticing Linda's worried state. Linda smiled tensely. Everything is fine, dear. Let's go into the house. Mark will help you with your homework. Ethan walked inside, and Mark followed, casting one last puzzled glance in the direction where Jackson was hiding. Linda paused at the threshold. Go away, Jackson, she said quietly. Please don't come back. Jackson emerged from behind the tree, dejected. Linda, No, she interrupted. You have no idea what I've been through, what Ethan's been through. In the present, Jackson felt the shame eating away at him from the inside. How could he have been so blind, so unfeeling? Meanwhile, back at the house on Maple Street, Linda and Mark were talking quietly in the kitchen after Ethan had gone to bed. Do you think we should tell him? Mark asked softly. Linda ran a tired hand over her face. I don't know, she said. He has a right to know, but what if it hurts him? What if Jackson disappears again? Mark put his arm around Linda, offering her silent comfort. The next morning, Ethan came down for breakfast and saw Mark alone in the kitchen. Where is Mom? He asked, yawning. She had to leave early, Mark replied, placing a plate of pancakes in front of Ethan. Ethan poked at his pancakes with his fork, looking thoughtfully at his plate. Mark, can I ask you something? Of course, champion. Ask. It's about my real father, Ethan said, and Mark froze, stopping his cup of coffee halfway to his mouth. What do you want to know? Why did he leave? Didn't he like me? Mark's heart sank at the vulnerable expression on Ethan's face. Hey, that's not it, he replied. It's more complicated than that, but it has nothing to do with you, okay? Ethan nodded, although it was clear that he was not entirely convinced. Outside, Jackson watched through the window, his heart sinking. He saw how warmly Mark interacted with Ethan, and he felt like an outsider. Determined, Jackson waited for Ethan to leave for school. As the boy passed, Jackson approached him. Hey, kid, is this your ball? He asked, holding a soccer ball in his hands. Ethan looked at him suspiciously. No. I thought maybe it rolled out of your yard. Are you playing? Sometimes with Mark, Ethan answered, relaxing a little. Jackson felt a pang of jealousy. Cool. You know, I played a lot when I was your age, too. They chatted for a few minutes, and Jackson enjoyed every moment, memorizing his son's facial features. I have to go, otherwise I'll be late for school, Ethan finally said. Sure, Jackson said, reluctantly letting him go. It was nice talking to you, Ethan. Ethan waved and ran on, leaving Jackson with a bittersweet feeling of joy and sadness. Meanwhile, in a luxurious mansion in the suburbs of New York, Maria finally learned where Jackson was. She hired a private detective who quickly uncovered the shocking truth. He has a son? Maria hissed, her eyes flashing with anger. The fool didn't even tell me about him. She paced back and forth across the spacious room, her thoughts racing. So that's the thing, dear, she grinned maliciously. You want to trade a life of luxury for a teacher and a child? Maria picked up the phone and quickly dialed the number. Mr. Johnson? I need you to find out more about this boy, Ethan. Yes? I want to know everything. And get the divorce papers ready. It looks like I'm going to need them soon. She hung up, her plan already beginning to form. If Jackson thought he could just leave her and his life in abundance, he was sorely mistaken. Maria was not going to go down without a fight. Linda spent the night in agonizing thought. By morning, with deep dark circles under her eyes, she made a decision. It was time to tell Ethan the truth. Ethan, honey, can we talk? Linda called after breakfast. Sitting on the sofa, she took a deep breath. Remember, you asked about your father? Ethan nodded, his gaze curious. Well, I need to tell you something, Linda began, her voice shaking. Your father, he's in town. He wants to meet you. Ethan's eyes widened. What? He's alive? Linda told him everything. How Jackson had left them, how she had found out she was pregnant later. With each word, Ethan's expression changed from surprise to confusion to fury. He abandoned us, Ethan shouted, jumping up from his seat. And now he wants to meet? No, I don't want to see him. Ethan, please understand. Linda tried to calm him down. Understand what? That my real father is a coward? Ethan ran into his room, slamming the door loudly. Linda sank down onto the couch, tears streaming down her cheeks. She knew it would be hard, but the pain in her son's eyes tore at her heart. Meanwhile, Jackson finally confronted Maria at her mansion. What are you doing here? She asked coldly. I thought you were too busy with your little secret family. Jackson was stunned. Where are you from? Oh, dear, Maria smiled bitterly. I always know everything. The question is, what are you going to do? I came to tell you that this is the end, Maria. I can't live this lie anymore. Maria's face contorted with anger. You think you can just leave after everything I've done for you? You manipulated me, Jackson replied. You fueled my ambitions, made me leave Linda. You went for it, Maria replied sarcastically. Don't make yourself a victim, Jackson. You chose money and power. I just showed you the way. Jackson felt a sting of shame. She was right. He made his own decisions. Well, now I choose another path, he said, heading for the door. If you walk out that door, Maria threatened, I'll expose all your dirty deeds. Every deal, every bribe. You'll lose everything. Jackson froze. He knew she wasn't joking. At Linda's house, Mark returned from work to find her still sitting on the couch, shaking. What happened? He asked worriedly. Linda explained to him what had happened between her and Ethan. Mark hugged her, but she felt the tension in his movements. Do you think I did the right thing? Linda asked uncertainly. Mark hesitated for a moment. I think so. But what now? Is Jackson going to be a part of our lives? Linda caught a note of fear in Mark's voice. He's Ethan's father, Mark. But you were always there. Mark nodded, but the tension in the air became even more palpable. That night, Jackson wandered the streets, his mind racing. Maria's threats rang in his ears, mixing with memories of the past. Images flashed before his eyes. Him brushing aside Linda's dream of a graduate degree. Him ignoring her needs in order to earn more. The realization hit him like a fist. His greed and selfishness had not only destroyed his marriage, but robbed him of precious years with his son. Standing in front of Linda's house, Jackson saw the light in Ethan's room go out. I'm sorry, he whispered into the night. I'm sorry for everything. He knew he had a long road ahead of him. Confronting Maria, correcting the mistakes of the past, regaining Ethan and Linda's trust. But for the first time in his life, it's okay, Ethan replied, pulling away and walking away. Jackson stood there, feeling like a fool. Later, alone in the hotel room, he cried for the first time in years, realizing the full extent of his failure as a father. Linda, watching his struggles from the sidelines, was torn. Part of her wanted to scream at him to stay away, to protect Ethan at all costs, but another part of her, one she barely recognized, felt sorry for Jackson. He's trying to contact you, Linda said to Ethan one evening. Why? Ethan frowned. He didn't care before. Linda sighed. People make mistakes, sometimes very serious ones, dear. He hurt you, Ethan answered quietly, his voice a mixture of hurt and sadness. Linda hugged her son, her heart breaking as she looked at his suffering eyes. Meanwhile, Mark, sensing a change in the air, made a decision. One starry night, he invited Linda to a romantic dinner. "Linda," he said, kneeling and holding out the ring, "will you marry me?" Linda froze, tears welling up in her eyes. She loved Mark. He was stable, reliable. But the proposal caught her off guard in the middle of this emotional chaos. "I need to think," she replied, noticing the disappointment flash in his eyes. A few days later, Ethan was riding his bike down the street when a car suddenly pulled out. Jackson, who had been watching from afar, rushed forward without thinking and pushed Ethan aside, both of them falling to the grass. "Are you okay?" Jackson asked, his heart pounding. Ethan, stunned but unharmed, nodded. "Thank you," he muttered, looking at Jackson with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Jackson wanted to hug Ethan, to tell him that he was his father, that he loved him, but he held back and simply helped the boy up. Meanwhile, back in her suburban New York mansion, Maria finally learned where Jackson was. She hired a private detective who quickly uncovered the shocking truth. "He has a son?" Maria hissed, her eyes flashing with anger. "The fool didn't even tell me about him." She paced back and forth across the spacious room, her thoughts racing. "So that's the thing, dear," she grinned maliciously. "You want to trade a life of luxury for a teacher and a child?" Maria picked up the phone and quickly dialed the number. "Mr. Johnson? I need you to find out more about this boy, Ethan. Yes? I want to know everything. And get the divorce papers ready. It looks like I'm going to need them soon." She hung up, her plan already beginning to form. If Jackson thought he could just leave her and his life in abundance, he was sorely mistaken. Maria was not going to go down without a fight. Linda spent the night in agonizing thought. By morning, with deep dark circles under her eyes, she made a decision. It was time to tell Ethan the truth. "Ethan, honey, can we talk?" Linda called after breakfast. Sitting on the sofa, she took a deep breath. "Remember, you asked about your father?" Ethan nodded, his gaze curious. "Well, I need to tell you something," Linda began, her voice shaking. "Your father, he's in town. He wants to meet you." Ethan's eyes widened. "What? He's alive?" Linda told him everything. How Jackson had left them, how she had found out she was pregnant later. With each word, Ethan's expression changed from surprise to confusion to fury. "He abandoned us," Ethan shouted, jumping up from his seat. "And now he wants to meet? No, I don't want to see him." "Ethan, please understand." Linda tried to calm him down. "Understand what? That my real father is a coward?" Ethan ran into his room, slamming the door loudly. Linda sank down onto the couch, tears streaming down her cheeks. She knew it would be hard, but the pain in her son's eyes tore at her heart. Meanwhile, Jackson finally confronted Maria at her mansion. "What are you doing here?" she asked coldly. "I thought you were too busy with your little secret family." Jackson was stunned. "Where are you from?" "Oh, dear," Maria smiled bitterly. "I always know everything. The question is, what are you going to do?" "I came to tell you that this is the end, Maria. I can't live this lie anymore." Maria's face contorted with anger. "You think you can just leave after everything I've done for you?" "You manipulated me," Jackson replied. "You fueled my ambitions, made me leave Linda." "You went for it," Maria replied sarcastically. "Don't make yourself a victim, Jackson. You chose money and power. I just showed you the way." Jackson felt a sting of shame. She was right. He made his own decisions. "Well, now I choose another path," he said, heading for the door. "If you walk out that door," Maria threatened, "I'll expose all your dirty deeds. Every deal, every bribe. You'll lose everything." Jackson froze. He knew she wasn't joking. At Linda's house, Mark returned to see Jackson. His face darkened. "What's going on here?" he asked tensely. Emotionally exhausted, Linda pulled Mark aside. "Mark, I can't marry you." The words escaped her before she had time to think about them. Mark recoiled as if he had been slapped. "Is it because of him?" he asked, nodding at Jackson. "No," Linda answered honestly. "This is for me, for Ethan." We need to sort out our past. I can't drag you into this. Mark left, broken and confused, leaving Linda devastated, but with some strange sense of relief. The next morning, Jackson's world came crashing down. The newspapers were full of headlines. Businessman admits to fraud. Maria, furious at Jackson's confession, leaked everything she could find to the press. Reporters besieged Linda's house, shouting questions about Jackson and Ethan's relationship. "Mom, why are they here?" Ethan asked fearfully. "It's difficult, dear," Linda replied, closing the curtains, "but it will pass." Jackson, surrounded in his hotel, watched his life fall apart. His assets were frozen, his partners had turned against him, and the prospect of prison became very real. Desperate, he called Linda. "I'm sorry," he said as soon as she answered. "I didn't mean for it to affect you." "I know, Jackson," Linda sighed. "But it happened. What do we do now?" Jackson closed his eyes, guilt eating him up. "I'll fix everything, Linda. Somehow." That night, as camera flashes lit up the street, Linda sat with Ethan in his room. "Ethan, I know this is hard," she began, "but your father, he's trying to do the right thing." Ethan was silent for a few moments. "Will he go to jail?" he finally asked. Linda's heart sank. "I don't know, dear. But whatever happens, we'll be together, okay?" Meanwhile, Jackson was faced with the reality of losing everything. But for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. The truth had a high price, but he was willing to pay it for the chance to be a part of his son's life. "I came as soon as I found out," Mark said. "How can I help?" Linda looked at him with surprise and gratitude. Despite everything, Mark still cared about them. "Thank you," she whispered, touching his hand softly. They split up to search as many places as they could. The night was falling, cold and menacing, adding to the desperation. It was Jackson who found a clue. In an old park where he had once taken Linda, he spotted a lone figure on a swing. "Ethan," he called, coming closer. The boy raised his head. His eyes were red from tears. "Why did you come back?" he asked, his voice shaking. "Why now?" Jackson sat down on the nearby swing, his heart heavy. "Because when I left, I made the biggest mistake of my life, and I have regretted it every day since." Ethan was silent for a moment. "You hurt Mom. You left us." "I know," Jackson said, tears in his eyes. "And I can't change anything, but I'm here now, trying to make it right. Even if you never forgive me, I want you to know that I love you, Ethan. I always have." At that moment, Linda and Mark ran up to them. "Ethan!" Linda exclaimed, hugging her son tightly. The scene was broken by the sudden appearance of Maria, who approached with malice in her eyes. "Is that so?" she screamed at Jackson. "You're throwing away everything we've built for this? For this pathetic little family?" Jackson stood up, placing himself between Maria and his family. "Enough, Maria. It's over." "It's over," she laughed bitterly. "You'll lose everything, Jackson. Your fortune, your freedom. For what?" Jackson looked at Linda and Ethan and then back at Maria. "For what money can't buy," he replied. "For family, for true love." Maria stepped forward, seething with rage, but Mark stood in front of her, holding her back. "I think you'd better leave," he said firmly. Maria, realizing that she was being confronted, cast a last contemptuous glance at everyone and left, leaving behind a tense silence. Jackson turned to Linda, Ethan, and Mark. "Forgive me," he said, his voice full of emotion, "for everything, for what I did in the past, for the chaos I brought into your lives. Tomorrow I will turn myself in to the authorities. You will no longer have to worry about me." Ethan, surprising everyone, stepped forward. Are you going to jail?" Jackson nodded, bitterness in his voice. "Probably, yes. I did wrong things, Ethan, and I need to answer for it." Ethan looked at Linda, then back at Jackson. "What if I want to get to know you better?" Jackson's heart filled with hope. "I would like this more than anything in the world, but I will understand if you don't want it." Linda hugged Ethan with tears in her eyes. "It's your choice, dear. We'll be by your side no matter what you decide." In that moment, under the stars of the old park, the broken family slowly began to heal. The journey had been long, there was much to forgive, But for the first time in years, there was hope. Jackson, Linda, and Ethan embraced. An embrace filled with tears, regrets, and, most of all, love. Mark watched with sadness, but with the knowledge that he had done the right thing. The future was uncertain, but they were together tonight, and for now, that was enough. The judge's gavel echoed through the courtroom, sealing Jackson's fate. He was found guilty of financial fraud, sentenced to 2 years in prison, and ordered to repay all of his ill-gotten gains. Jackson accepted the sentence with humility, surprising everyone. To him, it was a fair price to pay for his mistakes. In the months that followed, Jackson used his time in prison to reflect and plan for the future. He enrolled in business ethics courses and began developing ideas to help small businesses upon his release. Linda, true to her word, allowed Ethan to visit Jackson in prison. The first meetings were strained and awkward, but gradually father and son began to really get to know each other. "How's school going this week?" Jackson asked, genuinely interested. Ethan, at first cautiously, began to open up. "I had a math test. I think I did well." Jackson smiled proudly. "I'm sure you did it. You're very smart, Ethan." Over time, their conversations deepened. Ethan asked difficult questions about the past, and Jackson answered honestly, no matter how painful it was. Linda watched the relationship develop with caution and hope, maintaining clear boundaries and letting Jackson know that he had to earn his place in his son's life. "He needs you as a father," Linda told Jackson during one of their visits, "but I can't let him get hurt again." Jackson nodded, respecting Linda's decision. "I understand, and I will do everything to be the kind of father Ethan deserves." Meanwhile, life went on outside the prison walls. Linda and Mark, after much thought and honest conversation, decided to give their relationship a second chance. One sunny spring day, Linda walked down the aisle in a beautiful, simple dress. Mark waited for her, his eyes shining with love, and Ethan proudly carried the rings. Jackson, still in prison, received the news with mixed feelings. He felt a little sad, but mostly relieved, knowing that Linda and Ethan had found stability and love. When Jackson was finally released, he was determined to start a new, honest life. He began working with a charity that provided free advice to small businesses. "Now I want to use my skills for good," he explained to Ethan during one of their weekly meetings in the park. Ethan, now 12, looked at his father with respect. "That's cool, Dad." The word daddy still made Jackson's heart skip a beat. It was a title he intended to earn every day. Linda watched the new family relationship with caution. She and Mark provided Ethan with a stable, loving home, while Jackson tried to be a responsible, present father. A year after his release, Jackson attended Ethan's school science fair, standing next to Linda and Mark, feeling a surge of gratitude for being a part of his son's life, even if not in the way he had once imagined. "I'm proud of you, son," Jackson told Ethan after his performance. Ethan smiled and hugged him, and then Linda and Mark. It was a scene few would have imagined a few months ago. An unlikely family, but united by their love for Ethan. Later that night, as Jackson reflected on his journey, he remembered how he had been before, how he had neglected Linda and her dreams. Now he could see clearly how wrong he had been. "Thank you for giving me this chance," he said to Linda when she came to pick up Ethan. Linda nodded, her gaze softening. "You're trying, Jackson." Ethan sees it. We all see it. As Jackson watched Linda and Ethan leave, he felt a peace he had never experienced even in his years of wealth and power.